Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here during week 8 of this quarter on this Wednesday evening. Really appreciate your interest in learning more about the current state of APIDA, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, as a reminder. Before we begin our program, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the life of George Floyd. As Black communities mourn yet another Black life taken under the guise of safety and at the hands of police brutality, it is important that we as non-Black folks understand the ways in which we participate and benefit from anti-Black racism. It's always necessary to reflect on how we can take action as allies and accomplices, but it just feels even more relevant now than ever as we continue to witness the injustices that has always existed in our society. For tonight's State of APIDA, we will be hearing from some incredible APIDA movers and shakers on campus about the state of our community, especially during this unprecedented time where APIDA communities across the country have experienced anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. We hope that this conversation can shed light on the experiences of APIDA students, staff, and faculty here at Cal Poly, and we hope that this will inspire you to individually and collectively make commitments to supporting and uplifting each other. Just some general housekeeping stuff. We have both a chat feature and a Q&A feature as well. Feel free to use the chat if you want to make comments or give affirmations or snaps through the chat. We also have a Q&A at the end of this panel, so you could use the Q&A feature to send in your questions to the panelists. This is also a recorded event, so if for some reason you have to leave early due to other commitments or want to share this with a friend later, we will have this available for you as well. And with that said, I will hand that off to our moderator, Dr. Grace Ye.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I would also like to acknowledge that Cal Poly and where I'm situated right now is in Tilhini, the place of the full moon. I, on behalf of all of us, gratefully acknowledge, respect, and thank the Yak Tichu Tichu Yak Tilhini Northern Chumash tribe, San Luis Obispo County and region, in whose homeland we are guests. And actually, I'll take a cue from Manu, who is a moderator for the Angela Davis talk, and made the great point that it's not just enough to do an acknowledgement, that we can take that extra step. And I want to just say this is an opportunity for us to think about what care means, and especially during this very difficult and stressful time period that we're all going through, you know, in either small or large ways. We are all potential caregivers and caretakers. And so I just want to also recognize our responsibility in that regard. And I have this whole thing right now, this, which will be a part of the questions that we'll get to in our panel. But to think about the world that will be possible after and because of this moment, and that I hope we get to imagine a fourth world that is more caring. I have the privilege of this wonderful job. I am blessed that I have a job, that I have folks that I get to hug every day because I get to shelter in place with them. And so I feel fortunate to be able to be here and to share this space with you all. I also want to thank the organizers for entrusting me with being the moderator. I hope y'all don't regret it. And thank you to Lillian for making all of this possible. I really appreciate you and all that you've done for our campus, and all of our panelists as well. So I think next we're doing our panelist introductions, yeah?
Do I just start, or was there a handoff?
Let's do jazz hands though. Olivia!
Okay, there we go. That is me. Hi, my name is Olivia Tran, she, her, hers. I am the coordinator for Women and Gender Equity Initiatives, which mostly means I work in the Gender Equity Center, doing all kinds of gender-related things on this campus. It's a good time. I guess I'm supposed to share a little bit about like my journey and how I got here. So we can just pass it on to the next slide. It has some helpful visuals. So this is my family. um, I wanted to show this family portrait because I think it is really representative of kind of the environment that I grew up in and where I came from, which is to say that I was born and raised around San Jose, California, which for those of you who don't know, I always say has like the most Vietnamese people outside of the actual country of Vietnam. And so to me, this really means that I grew up in an environment where I was always really aware of being Asian, of being Vietnamese, because I was surrounded by my culture and by my family. But I was also in this bubble where I knew a lot of people who looked like me and knew a lot of people in the same sort of comfortable socioeconomic status as me, as well as sharing my ethnicity and my culture. And so for me, it wasn't until I kind of left a little bit of my bubble and went to college at UCLA that I realized like how different the world is almost, that I really got to meet people from different walks of life, from different experiences, from different racial ethnic backgrounds, and really like learn about them, hear their stories. And even then, it's so funny to say that because UCLA is also like 30% Asian. So like, it's so many Asian people, but like comparatively, it was such a huge difference to me. And so that was where I really got involved in doing sort of advocacy and activism as a student activist for our Asian American community. So there's a picture of like me with some of my pals in college, and we organized like a community town hall around sort of anti-Asian racism and kind of misogyny towards Asian American women. And from there, I kind of took my next step, I guess, of my journey by going to grad school at the University of Georgia, which is in Georgia. So that was across the country and like very, very far outside of my comfort zone. And so there I worked in the LGBT Resource Center. And so for me, that was another step where I was able to kind of explore a different part of my identity because I hadn't really been able to articulate what being a queer woman meant to me either until that point where I was like really working and doing that work on the day-to-day, and also experience something completely different because Athens, Georgia is obviously not like either LA or San Jose. And so I think that's brought me here to kind of like wanting to do the work of having these conversations about not only being APIDA, but also how that fits into kind of the grand scheme of things. And so how my identity really fits into that and the larger picture, and how I can both like realize what it means to experience different oppressions, but also acknowledge how racially I fit into a category where I do experience a lot of kind of just proximity to privilege. So yeah, I hope that wasn't too long. I will pass it on to the next person.
Hello, my name is Zoha. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a student assistant at the Gender Equity Center. I'm also a third-year ethnic studies and psychology major, and I have a minor in women's and gender studies. And I guess I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of how I got here, I guess, to Cal Poly, to my job, to doing the work that I do. I also grew up in San Jose, and I went to during middle school and elementary school, I went to like an all Muslim school, and so I grew up in a very like Muslim environment. All my friends were Muslim. I didn't like have a lot of exposure to people that weren't Muslim. And so when I went to high school, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, which was like the first time that I got to like meet people from different backgrounds that like didn't really share a similar experience to the one that I was familiar with. And I was introduced to like social justice issues. We were a very social justice oriented school. Definitely looking back on it now, like the social justice that they were kind of involved with, what isn't really what I would consider to be the work that I'm doing right now anymore. Like I think I've grown from the work that I did then, but it was like my first exposure to like social justice oriented work. And so I went from my high school and I started at Cal Poly. I started as an animal science student. I was in a very white major. I did not feel like I fit in. I didn't really feel like my professors were looking out for me. I was like an overall like really overwhelming, invalidating experience as like a freshman coming into Cal Poly. And so I was really searching for like people that could support me, like the people that I had back home. And so I automatically was looking for people that looked like me, people that had like similar experiences to me. I found a home in our Muslim Student Association at the cross-cultural centers. I got really involved with the cross-cultural centers and I found some of my closest friends. Some of them they're the bottom left photo. Those are some of my closest friends. I met them through the Muslim Student Association and through the cross-cultural centers. And I started to get really involved with the cross-cultural centers and the work that they were doing my freshman year, but I started working for them last year at the Gender Equity Center. This top left photo is OWN, Original Women's Narratives. It was my first year being a part of some like a theatrical production this big and this like something that meant so much to me. If for those of you that don't know, Original Women's Narratives is a theatrical production that is produced, written, and performed by Cal Poly's women-identified students. And this was it was a show that I watched my freshman year, and when I watched it, I was so like blown away by like how amazing and how much it really meant. Like I wanted to be a part of something like this, like a social justice oriented theatrical piece of work. Like I was part of theater in high school and I wanted to have that outlet here, and I couldn't believe that I found such a like wonderful project. And so I was a part of the script team last year, and I was also a part of the cast. So I got to perform in OWN. And this year we unfortunately did not get to have an online or an in-person performance of OWN, but we are working on creating like a accessible piece or like version of OWN for the community to take in. So like look out for that. But that's a little bit about how I got here and to the work that I've been doing. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Angelica. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and siya. Siya comes from Filipino languages. My family Sayan, and in siya it doesn't have a gender. It's like a general like pronoun. And I am a fourth year. My majors are animal science and comparative ethnic studies. And this year I'm one of the coordinators for Polycultural Weekend. So about me, I was born and raised in Salinas, California. The middle photo is me and my parents. That was the last day of preschool, I think, and our class had to like grow a sunflower, so our photos of the sunflower. And this picture's up on my wall, so I thought I'd share it with you all. And I am a child of immigrants, so my parents immigrated from a small island in the Philippines. The closest island to theirs is about an hour and a half boat ride away. It's a very small island. But when they immigrated with other members of their community from the same island, and they all settled in East Salinas to be farm laborers, like picking strawberries, asparagus, lettuce, all of that stuff. Salinas is known for produce. And so when they immigrated, they were able to have a support system. So growing up, I grew up in a predominantly Latinx community, and I grew up with like my Filipino extended family. In high school, the only Filipinos I really went to school with were my cousins. So coming to Cal Poly was like the first time I was with Filipinos who had a different background than I did. And I chose Cal Poly because I was actually hosting for Polycultural Weekend. I was hosted under Filipino Cultural Exchange. It was super cool. And it showed me what the culture, how strong the cultural community is, and how strongly they can unite for different events or programs or things on campus, and like to put it on yearly is super amazing. And I guess my engagement throughout the year has deepened. As a hostee, I was like, oh, this is fun. Like, I get to see SLO. I'm getting to meet new people. There's lots of people in my major that I'm meeting. But now as a fourth year, and after taking more ethnic studies classes, I've like come to understand coalition building and how important PCW is on campus. The picture on the left, where we're like all wearing blue, that was our committee color this year. I was the food coordinator, so that's a picture of my committee. We're missing a few people, but that's most of them. And I had a super great experience with them. They were really hyped and super supportive, even though PCW was canceled, and like was supportive of all the things that came into fruition afterwards. And the picture on the bottom right are friends that I've met through Filipino Cultural Exchange. And most of us met first year, and we've stayed friends throughout the year. And we took that like at the middle of winter quarter. So it's like one of our last photos together. So that's cool. But I've always been drawn to events that like explored culture, and now I want to learn more about coalition building, and I've like been trying to attend conferences, and I really appreciate that my friends share these interests with me too, and want to like build and develop these relationships around campus too.
Hi, I think I'm next. I'm Jennifer Teramoto Pedrotti. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity and Curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I want to say first, one of my favorite things about being on these panels is to hear all the things that the students are doing, because you all are so impressive, all of the different things that you're involved in and everything. I don't think I did quite as many things like that when I was in college, so I think it's really great to see young APIDA people doing these types of things for our colleges as well. Okay, so we represent a few different generations here on this panel, I think, and so I'm one of the older ones. So I'm going to take you back just a little bit, but I'm half Japanese American and half white. That's me in the right picture with the little page boy, with my dad's parents and my brother and sister. So my dad's family were, let's see, the first people to come from Japan was actually my great-grandmother, and she came when she was a little girl. And so we've actually been here for 5 generations in the United States now, which is a little different. I think that's more common in Japanese families, but less common in some of the other APIDA groups. But my dad's family were in the internment camps, the Japanese internment camps, and my father was born just a few days after they got out of the camps. And so, one of the questions that is on this is, how did your APIDA identity shape your life experiences, and how were you racialized as a person of color? And what that was like for my grandparents and my aunts, et cetera, from the time I was really little. So I don't know, I think that kind of framed for me what being Japanese was, and it had a lot to do with being really a big part of my identity. And so my dad is from California, but we moved to the East Coast when I was very little, and then we lived in Colorado as well. So for the first half of my childhood, I grew up in predominantly white spaces. You can see that my mom is white, my dad is Japanese American, but my dad was a little bit of a curiosity in those spaces. And so a lot of my friends at school, et cetera, were really interested in my Asian heritage. I remember this girl one time said I was going to have her over for dinner or sleepover or something like that. And she said, oh, can we use chopsticks? And we were having fried chicken, so I didn't think that was a good idea. But in any case, those kinds of experiences were kind of common for me when I was a child. In addition, there were only 9 Asian kids at my school, my elementary school, when I was growing up, and my brother and sister and I were 3 of them. But some of the other kids who were Asian were also adopted into white families, because that was a little bit of a trend at that particular time. And so even though I'm Hapa, I'm half, often that isn't really what I was thought of, because there were lots of people who had white mothers that were 100% Asian as well. And so my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She took us to school, etc. But I grew up lots of times being asked if I was adopted, because that was kind of the norm at that particular time. Then when I moved to California, I moved to the Bay Area when I was 12. And so that was the first time that I actually had a lot of Asian friends, and that people knew what it meant to be Hapa, and that I was kind of recognized for that for the first time. So I sort of grew into that identity there. After that, though, I went to UC Davis, kind of similar experience. But then for graduate school, I went to the University of Kansas, which is not similar to California or UC Davis. And so that was a really, really interesting experience for me to be, again, treated as 100% Asian, to be treated as though I was from Japan, to have people comment on my no accent and my good English and compliment me on those types of things. This is before microaggressions was a theory. So I remember when that theory came out, my friends and I were like, oh, that's what that is. Like, that's been driving us crazy this whole time. So I chose a couple pictures here because I wanted to show you. This is a picture of my dad, who, my mom and dad only live about 5-10 minutes away from me, and so they spend a lot of time with my kids. Those are my 3 children there. And the picture on the bottom is my husband and I, my 3 kids as well. And I put lots of pictures of them, partly so you can see, look, they look like me when I was little, right? But also so you could see that it's interesting to go from the picture on the top, where I'm one of the lightest people. You know, my mother is the very lightest, but I'm quite a bit lighter than my brother and sister, to the picture on the bottom there, where I'm all of a sudden the darkest. And that's been an interesting part of my heritage as well. I think I have a couple more pictures on the next slide. So I'll just say quickly, this is my Bachan and my Jichan, my great-grandparents. My great-grandmother lived right next door to my grandparents, and my Jichan had passed away by the time that I was born, but I'm named for my Bachan, and so she was a very important person to me in my life, and also to my dad. She lived until I was 19, so I was lucky to have her for that long. And then that picture at the bottom, you could probably find me in there with my 1990s haircut. But in any case, that's my extended family and all my cousins. Actually, that's not all my cousins, that's just some of my cousins. But I think I put a picture of them there as well, because to me, when we would come to East LA and get to see my family on Blanchard Street and get to hang out with everybody, that's when I felt the most Japanese in my life. And that's when I learned about Shogatsu, which is New Year's, which we to this day still celebrate with my kids, as you can see up there. So those are a few pieces about me that kind of got me to where I am.
Thank you for unmuting me. I couldn't find the unmute button. I'm sorry. That was really wonderful. And one of the things that struck me about your introductions is how important context has been in shaping your sense of community and sense of belonging. And you know, in terms of where you grew up, what that community was like, and what it meant for then all of you to end up at a place like Cal Poly, where then you had to find, you know, what that sense of belonging would look like in this context. That worked out really well in terms of the slides that I decided to throw in here, in part because I thought it would make sense to, when we're talking about the state of APIDA at Cal Poly, to look at what Cal Poly's demographics actually look like. This is the CSU based on fall enrollment. So this academic year, the demographic breakdown, and they have it ordered by largest ethnic racial group to the smallest. And so you see for the CSUs, that Hispanics have the largest representation, right? 43%. Non-Latino whites are at 22% in the CSUs, and Asian Americans are 15%. And then on the right side of the slide, you could see sort of the breakdown year by year. So you see that we've kind of, over the last 20 years, have slowly increased the demographic representation of Asian Americans. And this doesn't include our Pacific Islander or I think it doesn't include multiracial identity as well. So you got to take that number for what it's worth. And then can you move to the next slide? So this is what it looks like at Cal Poly. The numbers are pretty similar for Asian Americans. It's a little bit smaller than 15%. But Cal Poly, you see that now the white non-Latino is the largest demographic on our campus at 54%. And you know, Hispanic is now only 17%. So they are the largest ethnic, non-white ethnic group at Cal Poly, but they're not as significant as we see CSU wide. If you go to the next slide, you can see kind of the side-by-side comparison of California, CSU, and Cal Poly. And actually, let's do the next slide. This is where I flip the X and Y axis. So you can compare what the white non-Hispanic population looks like in California in the blue, CSU in the orange, and Cal Poly in gray. And so you see for Asian, what California looks like, what CSUs look like, what Cal Poly looks like actually looks comparable. But the huge difference, and I think this is what many of you are speaking to in terms of coming to Cal Poly, is the representation of people of color generally, right? So the white population at Cal Poly is nothing like what we see in California, nothing like what we see CSU wide. And I just want to throw in here, because I know that admissions looks at numbers like this, but to put it in context, right now, only 28% of the births in California were non-Hispanic white. Only 28%. So just let that number sink in. So that means the population that we see for California generally also takes into consideration an aging population that is more white than the new generation being born. So I thought it was worthwhile to just sort of give context to the numbers that we actually see, but I think more important than the numbers is sort of the stories about our experience. And so I appreciate Zoha's comment about how important performance and theater can be, because it means having control over one's own narrative and trying to put those experiences and put these stats into perspective. So our first question for the panelists is, given your own positions on campus and your own roles, what do you think is the state of APIDA at Cal Poly? And I think our order is Olivia's first.
Yeah. Thank you. So it's such a big question. So I'm gonna try to, say something meaningful, but also something that hopefully encompasses kind of what I have seen since I've come here. I think that the statistics that you just shared, Grace, are like really important and like a great way to like frame what I'm about to say, because I feel like the thing about being a PIDA at Cal Poly, but maybe even in general in an institution of higher education, is that we are like in real ways still minoritized as a racial and as our ethnic groups, but because of this kind of like percentage of APIDAs who participate in higher education, we are counted as like overrepresented or like equally represented to like the California state population. And so there's like this critical mass of APIDAs on Cal Poly campus where it's not like you're desperately searching for the person who looks like you, but it's also very difficult to come together and kind of organize in real ways, because we are still a minority of the population on this campus numbers wise. And there's a lot of mixed messaging around like, well, like, are we people of color? Are we minoritized enough? Because we have this like percentage that like actually represents, you know, the state population of APIDAs. And so I think the state of APIDA at Cal Poly is that there is this confusion about where we are as people, as communities, in the larger scheme of things, because there is this kind of like, well, do these issues really matter? Because I can kind of like put my head down and go from my day to day without it necessarily impacting me, which has been the reality for a lot of people, maybe not so much since we've come to this like turning point with COVID. And it's also very difficult because there's this lack of opportunity, I think, to educate ourselves about how we've come to this place and this unique racialization and this unique position of our APIDA communities, because it's not something that's heavily featured in textbooks, in school curriculum, but it's also not something that for a lot of us that we are able to learn from our families or our elders. Because for a lot of us, and I think obviously like Jennifer spoke to, this isn't the case for all Asians and all APIDAs, but for a lot of us, our parents are, and sort of like the generation above us is the first generation who experienced life in the US. And so they didn't really have a way to articulate what that experience was, what oppression meant to them, what racism meant to live to them day to day. And so they also weren't able to pass it on to us as our generation to like know what to do with that. And so we're kind of left on our own to really navigate these systems that our parents didn't necessarily have to navigate, or not that they didn't have to navigate, but they didn't like articulate. And so we are learning like maybe from our peers and not necessarily from like our curriculums or our formal educations, and kind of like trying to like reach across this very white institution to form these connections and these bridges in ways that we aren't really sure how to do because they haven't really been modeled for us. So the state of APIDA, I think it's interesting. I think we have a lot of opportunity here. And I think we also just have a lot of ways to learn to grow together because of how kind of nebulous our position is. And that's just coming from my perspective.
That was really great. I love the point about that we have been kind of left to learn from our peers and that we're missing sort of that kind of modeling, like you said. I think it's really important to keep in mind. Zoha, thoughts on the state of APIDA at Cal Poly?
Thank you, Olivia, for sharing. I kind of really enjoyed what you said about like we are kind of lost, and I've noticed that. I find that I see a lot of APIDA folks like on Cal Poly's campus have found like a very strong community within the APIDA community. Like they find like a lot of people who share their similar identities and will stick to them, and like they've created these really strong community groups. And like I love like these clubs will come together and they'll have like these spaces for people who share similar identities or just want to be or just like want to learn more about like the identities that various like APIDA folks have, and like the cultures that they have, and all the things that come with being a part of the APIDA community. Like I find that the community is very strong there, but we struggle on Cal Poly's campus, and I think generally as well, like to be in community with other people of color as well. Like we are on a predominantly white like campus, and so as like people of color, we should be like willing to and like actively supporting our fellow like people of color on this campus, specifically like our Black and Indigenous folks. We find that a lot of the times that we aren't there for them when they need that help. And so like Olivia had mentioned, like things are different now, things have changed, and we're finding that like there aren't that like people aren't aware of like issues that the APIDA community faces, because not only are we not aware of these issues, but like there's nobody to like there's nowhere for us to find this like these issues being talked about. Like nobody's starting that conversation, and nobody is actively going out and like advocating for us, because we're finding that we're not even doing it. And like I think that is like something really important for Cal Poly students, is to learn to we need to like learn to advocate for ourselves and like our identities and like the things that we need, but also be there for like other communities when they need it, because we can't expect other people to be there for us if we're not going to be there for them when they need like help. And so I feel like I've seen like the way we've come together. I've seen like clubs come together on this campus. Like I know that we can do it. I know that we can come and we can like come together and we can make changes, because I've seen that happen. Like PCW is such a great example. Like I didn't realize how many like cultural organizations there were on this campus until I was a part of PCW, and I saw the work that all these clubs were doing, and I was like, I wish I could see this work being done for like the Black community when they needed that help. When the blackface incident happened, I think it was like 2 years ago. It was my freshman year. Like I wish I had seen that. I wish I had seen that from my community. I wish I had like there are people doing that work within these communities, but they're finding that they're not getting that support, whether that be from like the institution or whether that be from like their peers, or like they're not finding that their work, the work that they want to do, is being supported by like in general, being supported by like through resources or through like educational like events like these. Like there are things that we should be seeing that we're not really seeing. And like I think this is like the second State of APIDA panel that we've had so far, and like seeing stuff like this where we are discussing these topics, and like we're able to like share with the rest of the community things that we don't really get the chance to share otherwise. Like I want to see like people come together and like show that like community support that that we find with like our like more fun events. Like I want to see us come together when it's like when things are going not so great, or like even when they are going great, like seeing us come together to like discuss issues of like the issues that we don't really want to discuss, because like what Olivia said, like it is easy for us to just like sit back and like let things happen, because we can just like fit in with the crowd and just like let things go, and like and we'll get by, but like will others? Like it's just something that we need to like ask ourselves. And hopefully like I'm seeing that there is a movement towards that. I'm really seeing that begin, and I'm really hoping that it continues to be done like throughout the next couple of years.
I think you're raising such an important point, Zoha. And so I want to, before we move to the next person's response, I want to sit with this point a little bit and sort of just ask the panelists generally, because we have a mix of folks here, right? Students, staff, faculty. This question, why? You know, because you're raising this point that we're not coming together ourselves, right? And that we're not always there except for these sort of fun events, like when things get really difficult or serious, how can we be there for each other? And so one question is, from your different perspectives, why do you think this has been the case at Cal Poly?
I think part of it is because we aren't pathologized in the same way that some of our Latinx and African American and Indigenous folks are, partially just because of that label, underrepresented to some extent. And if you hear about graduation rates and all of those types of things, we're usually in the group that's doing well. And so it's kind of easy to look the other way, I think, for our population sometimes. I've thought that, you know, it's kind of an interesting thing to have the spotlight be on us right now with regard to all the anti-Asian and anti-Asian American racism that's occurring right now. And I think that maybe, I'm hoping that our APIDA community is experiencing some things that kind of, I don't know, cause them to be a little bit more empathic and standing for some of our other communities of color on campus, just like Zoha's saying. Because I worry sometimes that when the spotlight is off of us again, it will be easy to kind of look away again. And of course, you know, spotlight shows what's under the light, but everything else is still there. You just can't see it. And that's still happening right now, obviously, even though the spotlight is kind of on us right now. So I think that's really important. And I will say that I take a lot of hope from the new folks that we have on campus. I think to have Lillian and Olivia here in particular, and in the cross-cultural centers, the two of you have done so much good work with the students already. And I think, you know, that community does exist in the students more than I've seen it exist before. There are more people talking about activism and talking about these kinds of things. I've been at Cal Poly since 2003, and this is one of the best times in terms of that, I would say. I think in the faculty side, there still aren't all that many of us. And so that's kind of an interesting thing as well. For years, Grace and I would kind of pass back and forth the advisor roles for the Asian American sororities and things like that, because we were the only two. And I recently was thinking, oh, we're not the only two anymore, but we kind of are the only two full professors still in CLA in any case. And so, you know, I think that we have more international folks, et cetera, that are here with us, but that's a different population. There are different experiences with that group. And sometimes that group understands activism differently, or racial relations differently than we do from living here. So yeah, so I mean, I hope we can keep our eyes toward each other and, you know, be standing up for each other, especially with regard to anti-Black racism that happens daily, as we know, hourly, as we know. And I would love to see us bind together to help our other communities and stand tall with them.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Sort of thoughts on why we see this in particular at Cal Poly? Because what I have is, you know, just from the collective comments, part of it is we don't have the modeling, as Olivia was saying. I was gathering also from Zoha's comments that we don't necessarily have the institutional support. And even though I don't think you quite put it in that way, I think a lot of the examples that you gave focused on student efforts, right? And what students initiate and see through to the end. And oftentimes it may be without any kind of compensation or course credit or institutional support, right? So there's so much that the students do, which is amazing, but are there ways where we could be doing better, right, as an institution? I think another thing that Dr. Pedrotti, or Teramoto Pedrotti, points out is, and this was something Olivia also pointed out, being a child of immigrant, or an immigrant themselves, right, or 3+ generation, or even mixed race, that these things shape our understanding for race. So part of it is actually the diversity within our APIDA communities, right? That can also pose a challenge in terms of seeing ourselves as having common experiences, right? Because we don't even have a common understanding or common background, and yet we still get lumped into this like one demographic category in the eyes of the institution and our broader society too, right? That kind of erases those distinctions.
Yeah, I can get on a soapbox here a little bit. So I think the point that you bring up that is really relevant here, speaking to what Zoha said, is that I think often we as the institution like pass along the responsibility to the students, because we're like, oh, like your students, like your voice is so important, like you're the only reason the university exists, but like realistically, like why is it suddenly their responsibility to do like all the labor of like creating change and creating community when they're students who already hold marginalized identities? And so I think this, and then what you spoke to about kind of like the diversity of experience, even within the APIDA umbrella, is also like an institutional point, I think, as well, where we lump all like Asian data together, where we really aren't acknowledging how much like variety, how much depth exists in the experiences of APIDAs. And that also erases a lot of the, you know, provable structural statistical inequities that a lot of specific ethnic groups face. And so that's also something that as an institution, we need to be actually paying attention to specific ethnic data rather than just saying like, well, we have enough Asians here, so they're all good and we don't have to allocate any resources to them. And so I think that's definitely an institutional point there, where it just isn't being looked at deeply enough to really identify where the gaps are and where the inequities are within the big umbrella that is APIDA. And I'll stop talking because I really want Angelica to get a chance to speak.
Yeah, so much of what you all are saying reminded me of a lot of different things. So I'm going to try to formulate my words in a way that makes sense. I think on some level, like students, especially if you're, I feel like on my, like from my experience, being a child of immigrants, like you're taught to survive, which is like something that Olivia was talking about. Because for whatever reason, because of whatever reason of that our parents are, or the generations before us have participated in this diaspora caused by imperialism, like for whatever reason we are in the United States. And once in the United States, like they want to survive and make it. And the American dream is so heavily embedded in so many cultures. I see it in my own culture, in the Filipino culture, and speaking with my friends who come from family from different backgrounds, from different countries. Like the American dream is also heavily embedded within their cultures and advertised and like held up on this pedestal. And that's the only, for me, like that's what my parents have taught. So have been taught and have internalized from their country, and also internalized while being in the United States, because we are in this structure of white supremacy. And along with that, like on some level as students, we internalize the messages that we're receiving from institutions. Like for example, like if the institution doesn't make you feel like you are significant enough to have, for example, State of APIDA. This is the second one where I've been here for 4 years, and I didn't really know too much coming into this, because like as I was taught when I was younger, like to survive, to get an education and like make it out. But there's so much more that needs to be done. And it starts with engagement. Sometimes it's social engagement. Like I've seen orgs come together. There was an APIDA open mic, and like that's beautiful, like celebrating being APIDA, identifying as APIDA, and creating that space for each other to celebrate and uplift each other and like hype each other up, but also make that connection deeper, because we are all at Cal Poly. And why do we all feel this way at Cal Poly? And why do we all feel this way in the United States? And how also we as Asian Americans participate and can be complacent in structures of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. Because as a model minority, on some level, we are afforded access to certain privileges that white people do have compared to other ethnic groups. And to unlearn what we've internalized is a long process. And I think the school should create space and give us space and funding to be able to build these relationships, because if we want to have an event, we want to like be able to feed the people that are attending our event. And I went to a conference specifically for Filipino American students in Southern California, and one of the points that the main speaker made was that when you are, it's kind of going on a tangent, but kind of on topic, but when you are missing food, like your own cultural food, you are missing a part of you. You are disconnected from something like, whether it being the like your family, your support system, or ancestrally, like deep down inside of you, there is something that is missing, and there's a part of you looking for it. And like the joy of being together with other APIDA students and APIDA organizations, like that is how we should be feeling as students on a campus that's supposed to give us a stepping stone into like the rest of our lives. That kind of like touched on like Dr. A's follow-up question and like the first question. But also like what I've seen from cultural organizations, especially because of Polycultural Weekend, we like every week the participating organizations like has talks about their events, and everyone does a culture night, which is really beautiful. And this year I've noticed compared to other years, a lot of people have also brought up like when they want to have culture nights, they also want to make it deeper and bring it and really hone in on like building community and coalition building with each other. And sometimes when someone's participating, they're like, we do this, and like someone's like, oh, we do something similar, and they're like, oh, we should like collaborate on this event and stuff like that. And it's really beautiful, and I think that should be showcased because this is often happening in small spaces where it's like just students. So yeah.
That was amazing, Angelica. The example of the food, I think that's a small one, but it speaks to a much larger issue, which you pointed to as our support system, right? And I think that goes back to the introductions that you all gave, that when you come to a place like Cal Poly, that's something that you leave behind, right? And then all of you have had to find, all of us have had to find ways to build that support system. And I think one thing that you mentioned was that you can find these in sort of on a smaller scale, right, in these small spaces. But one of the challenges and one of the exhilarating moments is when we scale up, right? And we're actually building these networks across our communities and collaborating or building these coalitions. And, you know, as I haven't been here as long as Dr. Teramoto Pedrotti, but I've been here a while. And that's something that I think I've been seeing more and more incrementally, you know, as the years go by, that it used to be much more competitive, you know, between student groups, very cliquish, or like we always talk about silos, but that we're finding ways to build those bridges across these divisions. But it is slow, it has been slow work. I want to turn to Dr. Teramoto Pedrotti to address this first question about how you see the state of APIDA at Cal Poly.
Yeah, so how I see it or how I think we'll change it. Are we still on the?
We're still on the first question.
I kind of said all my things. No,
we can use it as a transition to, it's a wide open question. Yeah. Okay, so well, you can think about both opportunities and challenges.
Yeah. There's one other thing that I have seen on this campus, I think in terms of our interactions with other groups of color, that I think is important as well. I think that sometimes I've seen that, you know, as much as we might kind of stay together or not necessarily mix with some of those other groups of color, there is some appropriation still of some of those other groups, and I imagine some of the rest of you have seen some of those things too. I was looking at this thing for my class, and I don't know if you've seen Amanda Stenberg talk about don't cash crop on my cornrows. It's a YouTube video. It's really good. She talks a lot about cultural appropriation, etc. But she has a statement in the end that says, what if we loved Black people as much as we love Black culture? And I feel like that's something that speaks directly to APIDA folks in general, probably, but something that I see on this campus a little bit too. And so I think, you know, if there are ways that we can kind of find inroads towards actually loving the people, you know, being with the people, helping people, as opposed to just kind of picking and choosing which pieces of cultures we're going to kind of cash crop on, right? Which kinds of areas we're going to just kind of borrow or take, or those types of things. And so that's one thing that I see changing, but I'd love to see change more as we kind of keep moving forward. And again, you know, I think it's easy for me to have hope right now, I feel like, because I feel like I'm hearing things from some of our APIDA students that I've never heard before in class, but also, I mean, I always hear good things from the Cross-Cultural Center folks. And so students who work with the cross-cultural centers just in general usually, I don't know, they get it. They understand a lot of these types of things. But I'm hearing that out just within the general community too. I teach intergroup dialogues, and so I have students from all over the whole campus, and I'm hearing more people talk about that. And I feel like I have more APIDA folks in that class than I've ever had before. And that gives me hope as well, because I think maybe as a group, we're kind of making a commitment toward learning how to talk about these things a little bit better, and not just staying silent, but getting into the fray in a way that feels comfortable for us. I don't know if you remember when Black Lives Matter started and was just kind of rolling in the very beginning with Ferguson, et cetera. There was an Asian American group, and Grace, I know you and I have talked about this before, but it was a group that came together and they started like a Google Doc basically, where they wrote out this letter to explain to their parents, many of whom were immigrants, why Black Lives Matter was a thing, and why some of the things that our community at that time was saying were still very anti-Black and dismissive of what was happening with regard to Black Lives Matter just in general. And I thought that was so beautiful. There's a video where they're reading it in all these different languages, and the idea of the Google Doc was that it could be translated into all of these different dialects and languages, et cetera, so that if you couldn't explain it in English to a parent who spoke another language as their first language, you could really kind of bring it home. And I thought it was such a beautiful way of kind of helping different generations to understand some of these things too. You know, I think sometimes my experience is a little different being Japanese American, but my family was very, I think embarrassed actually is a good word, embarrassed that they didn't somehow stand up and avoid the internment camps, which is silly, right? When you think about that, it has nothing to do with anything that they did, and they shouldn't have had to feel embarrassed about that. But because of that, I think we were told all the time to be loud, like you better speak up, you better do the right thing, you better make sure that you're standing up for other people. And I think, you know, we all maybe in our different communities could use the different kinds of experiences that we've had historically, and in terms of how our different populations have gotten to the United States, et cetera. Maybe those are sources of strength for us to figure out how to be a louder population sometimes in whatever actions still fit with our own cultural backgrounds and our the way that we want to be.
Thank you. I think this transitions us nicely to sort of the next question that we had, you know, sort of written out for our panelists, but a lot of the panelists have already been, a lot of you all have already been addressing the question of intersectional work, and more specifically coalition building. I guess it's obviously something that's really important now, because I think we're confronting it. So I have like 5 questions I want to ask. I'm trying to figure out which one should I ask right now. I guess what are the biggest opportunities that we're seeing in this moment, and the biggest challenges in terms of intersectional work? And so I kind of want to anchor this a little bit in the age of coronavirus, in the midst of a pandemic, because some of our answers, I think, apply to Cal Poly generally, right? State of Cal Poly generally. But what are we facing now that you think maybe is different, or maybe is the same? And how do we anchor this in this kind of intersectional work?
All right. Thank you for the question. You're always keeping us on our toes, just changing things up a little bit. I think that the sort of context that we're living in right now, and the specific situation that we're living in right now, serves as a really good example of the difficulty of doing intersectional work as APIDAs. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I think a lot of the times when we have conversations about being APIDA, about the racialization of Asians in the United States, like these are very novel ideas to people. They're novel ideas even and especially to APIDAs, because we haven't had the opportunity to learn about these in more formal settings. And that also speaks structurally to, you know, a lot of things like how many ethnic studies courses are we offering about Asian American history, and how many people do we have to teach them? Like one. And so when we have these conversations, when these things come up, we are always working from a baseline of, okay, we need to first teach about the history of Asian and other ethnic groups in the United States. We need to teach why that history has racialized us in a specific way. We need to teach why the model minority myth kind of came to be to kind of prop up Asian Americans against Black and Brown other people of color. And so we need to kind of build all of this very basic education. And we're constantly doing this, right? We're constantly trying to bring people in to kind of have our peers realize all of these racial structures that we live within. And so in the age of coronavirus, I think what I'm realizing is that this is the conversation that needs to be had. The reason why a lot, and I'm not going to say all, because I think that there are many, many Asian people who have experienced like outright discrimination and racial hatred, like just walking around on the streets. But the reason why for a lot of people this is like their first experience is because we have kind of sat very complacently next to white supremacy until this moment where it was convenient to target Asian people and as a foreigner, as a threat to the kind of order of the United States. And so we're having that conversation now. So the racialization of APIDAs in this kind of context where we are disposable to white supremacy, and realizing now that like we are people of color, we do experience discrimination, we do experience and live in a structure that oppresses people based on their race and ethnicity. And so it's like, I like to kind of imagine, like, if we're able to have these conversations now, like in a hopeful universe, if we're able to kind of have this realization, if we're able to kind of bring in our community members and our peers, will that make it easier in the future to have any conversations that go beyond that, right? Like to discuss topics of anti-Blackness in our communities, of appropriation of other community or other cultures in our communities, of like hyper-masculinity of Asian American men, of, you know, this invisibility of like queer APIDAs, like all of these things that I would really, really like to talk about in our communities, but because we're always starting at the baseline, we're kind of forced to establish a foundational 101 knowledge every time, rather than being able to delve into other issues or have people even willing or at the point where they're able to kind of productively discuss or learn more deeply. Yeah, I think that's it.
I'm chuckling because we got a comment in the chat that, because I was like, take my class. And actually there is an opportunity to audit Asian American Studies 101 for any of y'all. If you wanna do it, just shoot me an email. Sorry, this is totally not about me, but I really, really appreciate that comment, Olivia, because you're saying that we just haven't done the basic work, right? That there's just this fundamental knowledge. And I think that so much of the experience that we see in our students when I started learning and had to, in many ways, teach myself Asian American history and ethnic studies, that it was like, why am I hearing this all for the first time? And it totally reframes your understanding. And I think it's like a fundamental point that you're making, right? Like we need to do just the basic work of educating our broader our society and public and K through 12 and college. All right, so thoughts, so to come back to this intersectional work, and especially in this moment, Zoha.
Yeah, I really enjoyed what Olivia said about like the fact that we are starting from the baseline, and like having to do all of this work before we can get to like the real, not well, like the more in like the issues that take a lot more work to combat. But what I'm noticing now is that like people are really understanding that this is something that needs to be done and are really willing to do that work. People are starting to realize that like the APIDA community is not like, we can't exist separate from other communities of color. Like our like well-being is tied to the well-being of the other communities of color. Like we need to be willing to do that work and like do the work for like educating ourselves and like advocating for like the like issues that surround other communities, to be able to like also live like lives that are like not not live in ignorance, you know? Like when things like this hit, we realize just like how like messed up the world is. And it shouldn't have to take like things like this for us to realize that there are a lot of like issues, systemic issues that like have been in existence. It just, we weren't aware of them until now, when like, and like COVID will like bring down like the curtains and you'll see all the things that are messed up with the world. And people are starting to actually want to do something and actually bring about change. So like, it is sad that it had to be like, it had to come in this way, but I am like really glad to see that there are people willing to like get involved now and like are like actively trying to do work that not many people were doing before. And I'm excited to see like where the work takes us, like at Cal Poly specifically, like seeing like my peers and like the classes younger than me, seeing like what change we can bring about to this campus. Like I'm just like really excited about that, I guess.
Zoha, with the theater analogy again, I love that line, COVID will bring down the curtain, right? And reveal, you know, the operations of power as it's operating in our society. So rethinking who is behind that curtain, right? And how we can basically take over and build a better society that's informed and educated and just understands sort of this this care work that needs to happen. Angelica.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned care work. We got a question about trigger warning. There was the Zoom bombing for the Chinese Student Association, and I think it's really important to want to help, but also not impose anything that they don't want, if that makes sense. Like if like we don't want to like re-bring up that harm again, like by asking or something, like by saying like kind of imposing that like we need to help them. And if you have like friends in that organization, like if they reach out to you, or like you personally reaching out to them to see if they're okay, and like if you can extend like community building through that friend, and you don't have to like, how do I say, like re-trigger more people, because there like are a lot of people in the organization and like everyone's affected differently, and to be considerate of that. And also you like it was also asked like what this means in like COVID-19. Like I feel like a lot of people are on social media right now, and like to not repost like harmful content like Black bodies being brutalized, because we know it's been happening for so long, and like the people who like interact with your especially as like a non-Black person, like who how that impacts people that view like your stories or like however you repost that, like being considerate of your audience is really important, because we're all navigating through social media. Like this panel is happening through social media. A lot of these attacks are happening through social media and like, or through the internet. And like what Zoha and Dr. Ye were saying, like this reveals how the system of white supremacy is working. And like there are a lot of places out there where we can show support, and a lot of organizations, and like I've seen a lot of stuff on Instagram, and like the information is available to you, like because we are able to access the internet in this way. You can like small steps to building up to like this healing, if that makes sense. It can seem overwhelming, like thinking about like the greater system of things, but also like thinking about how we can bring healing into the spaces we occupy with like our friend groups, our families, or how we engage in social media is what I'd say.
Thank you, Angelica. I think those are really important points to keep in mind. It's connected to something that I had been thinking about, and maybe I was thinking maybe of throwing this out to the panelists, but y'all can ignore it if you feel like it. But one of the things, like you said, with social media, and especially with this current pandemic, with everything going online, that we're more susceptible to sort of reproducing this humiliation. So last week I was sitting in on a panel moderated by Kimberly Crenshaw, called Under the Black Light. And Kiesi Lehman, a writer and novelist, made this point about how Black death was the worst form of racial humiliation, and that we're seeing different forms of this. And so the Zoom bombing, right, is a version of it. And it kind of, I love the line and the way Olivia put this, that what we're looking at is APIDA are disposable to white supremacy, right? And I feel like this is connected to this idea of like any moment, any of us could be humiliated, right? And that there's always that vulnerability, and especially in this time, we're seeing that amplified. So I appreciate your point about like how to proceed with care when we see so many of our communities being harmed, and to replay the videos or to replay the trauma that we might actually be furthering, right, that kind of humiliation versus promoting that kind of healing. So thank you for addressing that for us. All right. Dr. Teramoto Pedrotti.
Yeah, with regard to the state of the intersectional piece, I think, you know, I want to echo what my other panelists have said already. I think that the points that you all made already are the same ones that I would think of in terms of us thinking about these kinds of things. And, you know, I think sometimes we might, you know, with regard to social media and what we're posting and things like that, think about who we're posting that for, you know, to some extent. And if this is to kind of shock people, You know, that's different than caring about a community. Or, you know, are we just doing that to prove in living color, look, this happened, which might seem like it has good intentions behind it, but again, has really negative intentions for the group to which it is happening to. And I liked what Olivia said about the white supremacy as well. I don't think I've ever said I liked what someone said about white supremacy, but in this context, was saying that we're disposable to that. That resonates with me as someone who is both Asian and white, because I think that's something I experience all the time, where I might be part of a white group and I'm considered white enough sometimes until I'm too Asian. Right. And so, and the same thing happens on the other side, of course. And so I think that's something I've grown up knowing, is that I might be disposable to either group depending on what is being discussed and, you know, what use it can have for those different groups. So maybe this is one place that, you know, our HAPA folks can kind of come in on some of that stuff as being people that kind of straddle a couple different cultural groups to think about how to explain that experience and to make sure that others understand that as well. I was going to say too that I think, you know, in terms of intersectionality, I think generation plays a big role in some of the way that we feel comfortable talking or speaking up, et cetera. And some of that has to do with immigration, right? But some of that just has to do with age and what people think is appropriate, or what is too loud or what is too quiet, or things like that. And I, you know, I think that for me, I want to be respectful of what my parents think about some of these things, and my grandparents, et cetera. But I also want to teach my children different things, right? And so spanning that and making sure that we're taking generation into account in an intersectional way in terms of what people are going to be willing to do or what they'll understand, but also kind of passing on those stories. You know, my children being a quarter Asian is kind of an interesting thing, because they're only a quarter Asian on the outside in terms of our life and the way that we're immersed in our culture. Their hearts are much more Asian than that, but you can't always see their heart when you just see them. And so I'm trying really hard to teach them about the privilege that they have and the voice that they might carry. I have one son and two daughters, and so it's a little funny to be raising a mostly white man, right? For me to be, my child is a mostly white man. It's kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of powerful, right? To have like a brownish mother raising a mostly white man and teaching him some things that that I wish people who are also white men would do for people in my group, et cetera. So I think, you know, figuring out ways that we can pass along those lessons. And, you know, somebody asked in the chat, are we moving away from our ethnicities and just becoming more American? And I think, you know, for me, being fourth generation, I feel like it kind of swings back and forth. I think that my grandparents and my great-grandparents were pretty immersed in their Japanese culture, not necessarily even Japanese American. I think that my father's generation tried really hard to move the opposite way, and his parents participated in that, keeping the language from them, not using Japanese names, you know, things like that, so that they wouldn't be treated poorly because of World War II. And then my generation is kind of coming back maybe towards some of those things, and I hope my children's is as well. So I think there's a lot of really interesting intersectional things. And one other thing I'll say really quickly, although other people said this as well, the fact that, you know, socioeconomic status really differs in our population depending on other kinds of statuses within our community. And I think that, you know, for me to be someone who's Japanese American, then I need to be an ally for folks who are Hmong and Cambodian and Laotian, and, you know, from some of the groups that came here in a different way and that have had less opportunities than my particular ethnic group has. And so, you know, I think that's really important for us to kind of think about just in general too.
I want to just connect to that last point too about taking into consideration socioeconomic status, because I think that is where we are in this current moment, right? We're facing probably the worst economy and joblessness that we probably haven't seen since the Great Depression. And so part of the work isn't just, I think what you're pointing at is that intersectional work and that coalition building isn't just across racial differences, but even within the APIDA community, we might not think of intersectional work in that way. Like, what does a, you know, like what is it, the Silicon Valley worker in the tech comm job, you know, like tech job, what do they have to do with the, you know, Hmong refugee that right now is really struggling, right? And are they in a sense in this struggle together, right? And I think it might be very difficult to see if one can be fine because they're working virtually, because that's what they do anyways, right? Whereas one doesn't have insurance, doesn't have wages, right? And so what does that work look like in this present moment? That was more of a rhetorical question, or just a comment, not one that you necessarily have to address. I think another point that you brought up is this sort of generational difference, which I think is worth thinking about as well. I think for a lot of APIDA folks, and especially in different ways at a white institution, that we're taught to feel embarrassed or ashamed of our parents, right? And so this is one of the hurdles too, I think, that confront especially younger folks. Like for me, it's different because I'm already a parent, and so I don't live at home. I don't have to depend on my parents for anything. And so I have that luxury. But I think it was personally for me a struggle to get this messaging from a predominantly white society telling me your parents are weird, right? Or your parents are oppressive, or, you know, like I never got validation for what they actually offered that is a source of strength. And one of the things you're pointing out is that with these generations, right, there's certain things that you do pass on and certain things that you don't. But maybe one thing for us to think about, and maybe this is kind of the follow-up question, is where do we, instead of seeing the humiliation that and the shame, right, that our society encourages, where can we see the APIDA community as sources of our strength? And especially in this moment. This was totally not a question that y'all were prepared to answer. So.
I have one thought to this. I'm a positive psychologist, so I often go that direction in terms of thinking about hope instead of the other side. But, you know, I've been reading more about Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism and those types of readings lately. And I think that can be applied to all kinds of different populations, right? So we could, you know, if we're thinking about our group, imagine ourselves as a population that is involved in activism and imagine ourselves in a different way than we see ourselves right now. I think sometimes it's really hard to work out a problem. I said I was a psychologist, so sometimes we get a little too mired down in some of those things and it's hard to see our way out of that kind of thing. To me, when I'm reading about things like Black Joy or Afrofuturism, it sparks something in me, even though I'm not a part of that group, in that, hey, like, I could be whoever I want to be here. We could be whoever we want to be here. And we can take some of the lessons that we're learning during this time when it's a really hard time for us and think about ways that we can look different, you know, in the future and have more multicultural groups as opposed to just our own ethnic group, et cetera. We want that too, right? But we could have more of that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think that there are a lot of ways to focus on, I don't know how much our different populations have endured, and different pieces of us have endured different things, right? But there's a lot of things that we've endured, and you know, the fact that we're able to kind of pass some of those things on and tell our future generations, et cetera, about what that looks like, and let them dream a little bit about what they want to look like or who they want to be, even if it doesn't fit what past generations have thought of as APIDA or Asian, et cetera.
Yeah, I kind of want to jump off of that. I think this is a little more personal and maybe not so much bigger picture. But I think when we speak about the idea of like finding joy in our identities, that's something that I think I have been coming a lot to in the past few years. And I think that has been really influenced, and I think I have spoken about this a little, but like by the fact that I'm not just an Asian American woman, but I'm also a queer Asian American woman. And so when we talk about intersectionality, those are kind of like the first two things that pop up for me because they're very salient identities to me. And the difficulty of being queer and of being Asian for me was that there were very few people I knew or even knew of who were queer and Asian as well. And so that kind of future was like this whole like nebulous thing where I was like, what does it mean? And I was like really embarrassed of like being interested in like exploring sexuality because like we didn't really have conversations about it at home. I didn't really know other people on who to like base my experiences. And so it was all very confusing until I think I reached this point where I realized that like, I think to also pull in an earlier point, as APIDAs, sometimes I think we get too caught up on this idea of like tradition or like the culture, the authentic culture of our motherlands or whatever it is, right? Like we want to feel really tied to something because we are living in a society that doesn't value that kind of treats us as different, but doesn't honor what that difference really means. And so we kind of get like, oh, well, like I want to be like authentically like Vietnamese or whatever it is. Like I want to feel a connection to whatever it is that this like core of Vietnamese-ness is. And so we get tied to this idea of like, how am I part of a tradition or how am I representing a tradition or a culture? But in kind of exploring what my identity means to me, what queerness means to me, what that kind of expansiveness of sexuality means to me, I think I've realized that there is a joy in being able to like define my own identity and to like be not someone who is based off of like her predecessors, her ancestors, some idea of like authentic Vietnamese-ness, but someone who has these intersecting identities who can define her own future and her own path and what those identities mean to her. And that was really weird. I just spoke to myself in third person for like a really long time. That was weird. Okay, but I think to me, that's kind of where the idea of joy comes in, where there's joy in kind of creating a future for myself. So there's that.
That's a perfect setup for the last big question for all of y'all, and it ties in with the comment in the chat for a Student of Color Summit theme on POC futures. I love it. What does that future look like? Actually, the original question that I wrote is this an apocalypse or is this a revolution? It's a question that I've been obsessed with, since the start of the pandemic. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Is this the apocalypse or is this a revolution that we're seeing?
So I'm gonna talk again because it is my right as the person who signed up first in speaking order. I love this question because I think that we can't have revolution without the apocalypse almost, right? Because what we're looking at is like this world that is built on structures that are designed to oppress people, to harm people, to perpetuate violence against people who are deemed not within the norm, not within the privileged group. And so I think there needs to be the end of that world in order for us to really truly rebuild and have a revolution. And so I think that at the same time that everything really feels like it is collapsing all around us, what it really is doing is like revealing that these structures are meant to collapse because they aren't ones that are built for the well-being of all people. And so I think that, and I hope, and I know like there's a realistic side to me that's like, no, nothing's really gonna get better. But I hope that what being in this moment in time means is that there is a realization that we do need like an apocalypse in order for there to be a revolution.
I actually have also been thinking about this question a lot. And what I believe is that this is definitely an apocalypse. Apocalypse meaning like the end of the world as we once knew it. And again, as like Olivia was saying, for us to move forward, we need to see like the end of like these systems that are in place that are keeping us from moving forward. Like it's hard for us to come up with a future that we're really invested in if we're like still stuck in this world that like we're attached to. Like people are still hoping to come back to this normal that they once knew, but like that normal doesn't exist anymore. We're now like coming up with ideas for what we want the world to look like in the future. Like we are starting to see that people are believing in like some of the things that they are dreaming about, that because of this like apocalypse, as you want to put it, there is going to definitely be like a revolution. I definitely believe that we're going to see some good come out of this. Obviously there's been a lot of bad, but I've seen people like people that I know, people like on social media, on Twitter, like all around the world are just, they're like really hoping that something comes out of this, like that we can get rid of a lot of the systems that are in place that are keeping us from doing what we want to do. Like and one of the biggest catchphrases right now is eat the rich, and I fully endorse that. But there's like other things, like people are really seeing the ways in which like the system is rigged against them and rigged against everybody, and like they're willing to put in that time and that effort to create a world that they really want to see and like really are dreaming about. And they're like, people are finally realizing that for us to move forward, we do definitely need to like break down everything we know, all the like systems that we know, because changing things from within is not going to do as much good as it is going to do harm, because it's when you're working within a system, you are falling victim to it. And so it's hard for you to do that work and like create something meaningful from that when like the system that you're trying to break down is trying to break you down.
Yeah, like building off of what Olivia and Zoha were saying, it really reminded me of this conference that was online, but it's also on YouTube if you want to check it out. It's called the Central Coast Social Justice Education Conference. And there were people like from Santa Maria, super close to San Luis Obispo, that participated in it. And the keynote speaker said this quote that I like wrote down when I was listening, that to like dream of, to create a new future, we have to dream of it first and then take action. And one of the panelists also said that like the burnout comes from the resistance of being under these systems, because social justice work is actually really liberating, and it like unites people, and it makes people feel valid in their identities and like how they navigate the spaces they're in. And also like to touch on like apocalypse or revolution, the keynote speaker also showed this wheel by Deepa Iyer, and it's called Mapping Our Roles in a Social Change Ecosystem. And traditionally we like think of social justice. Yeah, thank you for whoever like dropped the link. And to, what was I saying? Traditionally we think of like social justice as like out being in protest or like always being a disruptor, but there are a lot of different facets to social justice and creating this different world. Some of in the image, it showed that there are weavers, guides, storytellers, healers, disruptors, caregivers, builders, visionaries, frontline responders, and experimenters. And I highly recommend you go check out that conference, because the keynote speaker goes in depth on each into each of these, and like if one of these words like or positions, I guess I don't really know how to phrase it, positions resonates with you, like go check it out. It's super good, and it's like super relevant to like us being in an educational system and us having a state of APIDA, and wanting to create change in a time of like apocalypse and revolution. So yeah.
I just want to add one thing too. I mean, I think it's sort of easier to just say apocalypse and stop, right? Because that's what we expect, and then we're not disappointed, and and all of those things. But I think what the other panelists are saying, and what I think too, is that it's harder to hope, right? It's scarier to hope because you could totally be wrong, and that's going to crush you then, right? But I don't know. I've been trying this new thing where I'm trying to have more hope just in general, about the goodness of people and about what we can do in our life and how we can make change and what can happen at Cal Poly and also beyond that, of course, as well. Again, it's scary to say that you're going to hope for these kinds of things because you could be wrong and that could be embarrassing or something. But the older I get, the more I think I would rather be a person that hopes than a person that's right. And so, you know, I think sometimes you could be both, and I'm going to shoot for those kinds of pieces a little bit right now, where I'm going to keep hoping and hope that if a lot of us are doing that at the same time, maybe there's some energy that builds from that allows us to get to where we are. And if we're so busy looking at the apocalypse, maybe it's harder to rebuild and to figure out what we need to do next and how we can come together as a community.
This has been amazing and such a privilege for me, because I feel like that question I've been having to mull over on my own. And so I appreciate y'all getting pulled into my thought experiments here and being the subjects of my question. Maybe one way to tie in what all y'all are saying about hope and dreaming and sort of this future is, as for Cal Poly and where I kind of started the question, that future is already born, right? This was when I was telling you about all the brown babies that have been born in this year, and those are going to be the ones that can apply to Cal Poly 18 years from now, right? And so we're basically in the moment where we're preparing that future for this generation that already is here, right? So a lot of work, and I'm super hopeful because y'all are the folks that are here that are going to be with in community with me and with everyone that is doing this work. So we now move into the Q&A session of the State of APIDA, and so I thank the panelists so much for their thoughtful answers and this opportunity to have this conversation. Lillian, you want to take over for the Q&A, or how are we going to do this?
Yeah, if folks have questions that you want to direct to all or some of the panelists, you can either drop them in the Q&A or the chat, or you could also raise your hand and I can allow you to talk, and then you can speak directly to the panelists as well.
There's also so many great comments and resources and things that people are offering in the chat. So I really appreciate the audience involvement here too.
It looks like we got a question from Akimi Navarro. I think Angelica touched on this a little bit, but I don't know if other panelists wanted to speak to it. It's about how you all might feel about the situation when CSA got Zoom bombed by racist people, and sort of like how to fight racism during the time of coronavirus when Asians are being attacked when it's not their fault.
I have one thought about this. I mean, first of all, I think it's never people's fault when they're attacked, right? It's never people's fault when racism is directed at them. And I think sometimes I mean, I don't know, I've felt like that before. I felt embarrassed when I know something racist happened to me in the moment, and that actually doesn't fit with what's happening. That's not me, it's external to me, it's something outside of me. which I think is important. But I think Angelica said this before, that it's really, really important to check in with communities and see how they want you to help. I think that there are a lot of well-meaning people that are not part of that community that have thought we should do this, or we should do this, we should do this, and maybe haven't checked in with that community. I think Grace and I were together when we heard about that, and we kind of strategized quickly about how can we offer support? How can we do this? What resources do people need? Do they know how to do this? Can we talk to the advisor? You know, some of those types of things. And for to